Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ina Paricio. I am a marketing manager here at EDB. I'm going to be your host today for our webinar, New Options for Moving Oracle Databases to the Cloud. I'm joined today by Ashleen Wright, who is our Director of Product Management, and Benjamin Anderson, who is our Cloud CTO at EDB. Before I turn it over to them, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items. Number one, this presentation is being recorded, so we'll be sharing the recording as well as the slides after the webinar. And then two, the lines are currently muted, so if you have any question, just drop it in the question panel and we'll get to it during the webinar. With that said, I will hand it over to Ashleen and Ben to kick us off.
Great. Thank you so much, Ina. So today we're going to walk through new options for moving Oracle databases to the cloud. And Ben and I are going to share a little bit about kind of what exists today, what migration options are available, and how EDB can help. So I'm going to set the stage first off and talk through considerations for you. So if you've got Oracle workloads and you might be looking to move to the cloud, we want to walk through some of the factors that you might need to consider as you actually think about a migration or a move to cloud. So I'm going to walk through a few different options for Oracle in the cloud to start with. And I'm going to actually kind of center, so I'm going to start with the left, naturally, with Oracle and their cloud platform, also known as OCI. They have a few different fully managed database service options. And I think it's worth kind of spending some time just sort of discussing kind of from Oracle's perspective, the various options here. So for example, you can get Exadata as a managed service. This would include being able to run RAC-like workloads on Oracle's cloud. And, in theory, I think from a familiarity standpoint, this is, all very Oracle specific. In addition, kind of looking out at other cloud providers, AWS also has a few different options today. So one of the options is Amazon's RDS for Oracle. So you can actually procure standard or enterprise, and they have a few different options. So you can get standard right via RDS for Oracle, and the license is included. Or you can choose to run enterprise, but in a BYOL type of fashion where you're bringing your own licenses. And similarly, AWS actually just launched Amazon RDS Custom for Oracle, where you get a fully managed service, and it's actually running in your AWS account. So you're getting a little bit more granular access to the operating system, the underlying database environment as well. And similarly, this is actually also a BYOL type of model where you're still bringing the Oracle licensing to that cloud provider environment. And third is something that actually Microsoft and Oracle have done together. And this is an interesting one because there's actually not, I would say, like a ton of content out there in terms of like what's available, but with Microsoft and Oracle, through something called Oracle Deems Interconnect, there's an ability to leverage Microsoft Azure. So they have something called ExpressRoute, where you can connect that into an Oracle cloud environment, OCI. And one of the things that's kind of interesting here is that your database workloads would still necessarily be running in OCI, but you can actually connect into Azure for this type of environment. So, it's a little bit slightly different than a fully managed Oracle service coming from Azure, which is not available today. So you can see here, there's a few options, of course, like what you would expect from some of the bigger CSPs, but all in all, I think, when we look at these across the board, there are some limitations to actually consider. So, first off, there's no support for RAC if you're on a non-Oracle cloud. So given that RAC tends to be a pretty popular and I would say important requirement for more sophisticated enterprise workloads. This can be a pretty big limitation if you're, for example, looking at the AWS options, or even if you were to run an Oracle license on IaaS on one of the other CSPs. And it somewhat limits the workloads that you can move and also potentially locks you in, I think, to OCI if that's an important factor for you in terms of running RAC itself. The other consideration here is that just kind of pointing out, like on that prior slide, there's not actually that many options out there. And, you could definitely run Oracle databases on infrastructure as a service from a CSP. But one of the things that's important to recognize is you're still facing some of the same license costs, rigidity of the contracts that you're experiencing potentially on premises. And with that, you're also subject to certain license changes. So for example, in 2017, Oracle actually changed some of the vCPU licensing in a cloud environment. And I mean, seemingly overnight, some of the implications actually double the license costs for customers. So, while you can choose an option for running it in kind of an IaaS environment or in a cloud environment, it's still at the whim of your existing licenses and contracts in place. And I think one of the other pieces to mention is around kind of innovation in general. So we've seen a tremendous amount of innovation going into a lot of open source services, but also especially Postgres, where you're starting to see a lot more innovative offering models such as serverless and investment going into those other types of offering models. And one of the things to consider here is, like, when you look at your database workloads sort of across the gamut, you may be losing out if you decide to just sort of lift and shift everything from Oracle into the cloud. And when you're actually migrating, it's, I think, important to look at sort of where the investments are going, what types of models you may be able to take advantage of when actually looking at a migration. So next up, I'm going to spend a little bit of time kind of looking at other options. So, we showed what exists for Oracle. You saw there's a few options there, but it's not extensive. So, okay, well, where does that leave you? What else should you consider from a cloud database perspective? And I think it's worth kind of showing some of the Stack Overflow data, just because, this really speaks to the popularity of other options out there. So, when looking at Stack Overflow, this is the 2021 most loved and most dreaded databases. And one of the things that sort of jumps out immediately is the prominence of open source in general. And Postgres, namely, has been the most loved RDBMS for like all the 5 years that it's been asked. So it's a natural choice. It's a popular choice, especially for relational workloads. In addition, on the popularity scale, it increased from 36% to 44% in 2021, gaining quite a bit of popularity over MySQL. And, it's interesting when you kind of look at Postgres and its adoption. It's highly extensible with sort of the data types that it can actually support. It has a really strong community. It's truly an open source community as well. And the other interesting factor is, like, you see all sorts of investment. So for example, it's become a strategic choice. So for example, with the investment in Babelfish and the investment from different independent software vendors, it's become sort of a de facto accepted and standard source for like enterprise workloads. And, I think one of the things to consider here is that a lot of enterprises are moving workloads to Postgres. And I think it's a really dominant and valid option for you to kind of look at when you're looking at Oracle and where to migrate. I did want to touch too on the fact that when you look at Postgres, right, and you're considering cloud options, like what's out there today. I think in contrast to what we saw with Oracle, it's really interesting when you look at this is just sort of a scale of the options. This isn't even all of them. So, this is definitely a subset of what's available for Postgres in the cloud. So, you've got most of the CSPs, I should say the major CSPs that have got their Postgres offerings, but you've also got different software vendors. So for example, EDB's BigAnimal database as a service offering, you've got Ivan and Crunchy. There's other players out there too, like Heroku, that have clearly established Postgres as a popular, valid cloud offering. And, one of the things I think is important to consider is the extensive breadth of options available to you. And, when you're looking at in contrast to Oracle, this really sorts of opens you up into more innovative models and like the ability and flexibility to sort of run across different clouds. So with that, sort of taking a look at the Oracle options, shining a light on Postgres, I think it's important to kind of look at, all right, well, why not just migrate from Oracle directly to open source Postgres? Like what are some of the considerations that you should take into account? And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ben, who's going to kind of walk through some of the considerations for you to think through.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. So if you can go to the next slide. So fundamentally, let's take a little bit of a step back here, right? The concrete answer to Ashley's question, right, is obviously that migrating database workloads is really, really hard, right? You can be unhappy with your database vendor for years and years and years, right? I think a lot of folks are unhappy with their database vendors. But the cost of migration, as a lot of folks know, can be tremendous, right? And I think even folks who are superficially concerned about that, maybe even underestimating the level of work when you start to bring in the cloud into the story, right? I'm on a legacy database, I'm on Oracle, I'm on DB2 on-prem. My business is moving to the cloud. Not only do I now have a database shape problem, I have an infrastructure shape problem where regardless of whether or not I want to go to a cloud infrastructure as a service model where I'm running virtual machines and I'm deploying Oracle on those virtual machines, or if I want to go to a database as a service type model, a platform as a service model, where the infrastructure provider or the other cloud provider is running the database. Either way, you've got a much bigger lift, right? Even if you just wanted to stick with Oracle, right? So combining these two things together, saying I'm going to make a database change, I'm going to make an infrastructure change, starts to make things pretty daunting, right? EDB recently surveyed some, 1,000 IT professionals, DBAs, enterprise architect types. And the number one concern for getting their businesses to cloud is data migration. Right, so this is not just a problem for the sort of database geek types like me, and I think probably other folks listening on this call. It's a problem for businesses as a whole, which is both good and bad, right? In some cases, you don't want the sort of lens right pointed at you, but at the other, from another perspective, it can be an opportunity to get investment in really modernizing your workloads, modernizing what you're doing, because this can be so critical to the business. Right? If data migration is the reason you can't get from on-prem to the cloud, you've got big problems, right? And ultimately, right, Ashley talked about Postgres. Postgres is clearly, we were in an EDB webinar, we're a bit biased, but Postgres is clearly kind of the winner in this space in a lot of ways, in part because it's an extensible database and it's the most kind of serious object relational database out there in the market in the open source space. But deciding to go to Postgres is kind of just the easy part, right? You're just stepping your toe into the water of your whole project. whether that's migrating on-prem, whether it's migrating cloud to cloud, whether it's migrating all the way on-prem to cloud, right? Actually, if you go to the next slide. Thanks. So if we dig in a little bit more on that, right? Again, migration is complicated. There's a lot of ways to break things down. And so I've got here, you pick some infrastructure, whether it's cloud, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, you migrate your schemas, you migrate your applications, you migrate your data, and you're done, right? You're up and running. Obviously, you never want your executives to see this slide because they will think it's way, way, way too easy. Because in each of those categories, there's other ways you could break this down, right? But each of these categories, there's sort of this morass of complexity and hard, technical, awkward human problems that you need to be able to tackle if you're going to have a successful migration, right? So if you're just looking at the infrastructure side, right? If you're going to cloud as part of this migration, so you're on-prem, Oracle, you want to go to cloud Postgres, what does your deployment scenario look like? Are you going to go to virtual machines? Are you going to go to a platform as a service offering where somebody else is running the database for you? What does your resilience story look like? What are your applications doing for resilience? Are you prepared to handle a 2 millisecond latency for synchronous replication if you want to deploy your database across 2 availability zones? If you're using RAC, right, that's just not going to work, right? Do you have a RAC dependency? How are you going to get RAC on the cloud unless your business's strategic option is OCI? And frankly, if your business's strategic option is OCI, I'm not sure you're at this webinar to start with, right? How are you going to get the performance you're expecting? Right? The performance of the systems in your on-prem environment is going to be very different than performance of systems in cloud environment. Even if you're running Oracle on virtual machines, the performance of a Postgres system on virtual machines is going to be somewhat different. How are you going to get assurance that that performance isn't going to negatively impact your business and your customers, right? Similarly, we kind of get up a little bit higher into the actual database space, right? On the schema side of things, how are you going to handle syntax differences between Oracle and Postgres? How are you going to do that consistently across different applications? How are you going to ensure that the semantics ultimately end up the same? Do you have a lot of expertise in both systems in order to understand, right? You can't just take an Oracle expert and tell them to look at Postgres and guess at things, right? Because you're going to make mistakes. It's hard, right? And you might leave landmines for yourself further down the road. Similarly, on the application side, right? How much does the Oracle infrastructure spider out through your application? The semantics of the cursors, for example, in the Oracle JDBC drivers, do those impact multiple parts of your application stack? So when you go switch to a Postgres JDBC driver, is that going to affect you, right? And affect all of your application developers who now have to learn a bunch of new software in order to work with their database. And finally, and maybe most importantly, is just the data migration itself, right? Everything else is sort of a human technical decision. But on the data migration side, right, if you've got a couple of terabytes, 10 terabytes, 100 terabytes of data to move, there's physical realities involved in getting that from point A to point B, right? There's sort of hard distributed systems problems involved in understanding how am I going to keep those two systems consistent, right, if I need to. So you have to decide on a high level migration strategy. Are you going to do a bulk migration where you shut down your applications, take a maintenance window, move all the data over to the cloud and Postgres and boot them back up, right? Is your business willing to take that much downtime? How much downtime is that going to be? Are you going to invest the time in testing it, right? This is complicated stuff. If you're going to do it in a continuous ongoing replication, right? So you set up a Postgres system in the cloud, you replicate to it continuously until it's caught up, you take a short maintenance window and then you cut over. That might be a much nicer solution. But what technology you're going to use to do that, right? There's a lot of choices out there and most of them are not super mature. If you do go that route, right, what happens? Are you going to provide yourself a fallback mechanism? What happens if you discover a bug after the cutover? You've been writing to the new database, the Postgres in the cloud, and you realize that there's a problem. You need to fall back to Oracle. Have you been dual writing to both systems the whole time? Did you set up a replication back from Postgres to Oracle? What technology did you use to do that, right? You could go on for days with this stuff. It's very, very complicated. And it's not something that really, that can be taken lightly at the end of the day. Right? Actually, if you can go to the next slide. So ultimately, this is all kind of pessimistic, right? You want to get to the cloud. You're using Oracle. Maybe you're already using Oracle in the cloud, but you want to get off of Oracle. You've kind of got limited options, right? As Ashlene's talked about back at the beginning of the webinar here, you're not really getting the full benefits of moving to cloud if you're just lifting and shifting your Oracle workloads, right? you're going to be paying more for somebody else's infrastructure, right? You're renting hardware from Amazon, you're renting hardware from Microsoft, you're paying more for that hardware than you were on-prem. And you're not really opening yourself up to the sorts of dynamic application development, database development workflows that you really want to get to the cloud for. Maybe you're making life easier for the application developers because now they're on containers and Kubernetes and they can rock and roll with all these cool things. But you're missing an opportunity there. And I think ultimately, you're not going to get there with Oracle, right? You have to make a shift. If you really want to get the full benefits of the cloud, you've got to get your database over to a more, I don't want to say cloud native, because I think that's too simplistic of a framing, but a more cloud shaped offering, something that has investment in the cloud, right? On the Postgres side, there's definitely some appeal there, right? And as Ashleen said, there's a lot of investment there. Folks are building software to make Postgres better in the cloud. Amazon's doing a lot of work. Microsoft's doing a lot of work. The ISVs are doing a lot of work. There's cool stuff happening in the Postgres world, and I think that's going to continue. Postgres is a good bet. But Postgres is not Oracle at the end of the day. And while there are some data migration services out there in the major third-party clouds, they're really focused on kind of the data side of things. They're focused on how do you get data from point A to point B, right? They're not focused on that full scope of migration that I was describing in the previous slide. Actually, if you want to jump one more slide, please. So you're an EDB webinar again. Obviously, we have a position here. And we think we can help, right? If you're familiar with what we've been doing over the past 15 years, right, this is kind of like our core business, right? Our expertise is in getting folks from Oracle to Postgres successfully, reliably, and repeatably. We know this isn't necessarily just a one-time thing. You've got many applications. You've got maybe a strategy for slowly shifting workloads away. We've got experience in that. We've got expertise in that. We're ready to help organizations make this transition, right? We do that with a kind of a bunch of different things, right? There's a lot of different ways that we attack this because, again, the space is pretty complicated. Actually, if you go one more slide. I kind of like to talk about this along 3 different ways, and 3 is kind of a nice number for these sorts of breakdowns. And it really focuses on both a combination of technology and our human expertise here. So on the technology side, right, the fundamental level, EDB is committed to compatibility, right? Open source Postgres is not compatible with Oracle. Now, while there are tools out there like ORA2PG, ORA-FCE that provide a good experience, right? They're great. You know, open source is fantastic. I spent a lot of my own personal time and my professional time over the past 15 years working on open source. But the level of sophistication in those types of tools is still kind of limited, right? If you go to Microsoft and you say, how do I migrate Oracle workloads to Postgres? They're going to hand you a 300-page PDF. And that 300-page PDF is going to say ORA2PG in there somewhere, but it's still a 300-page PDF, right? There's complexity there that those sorts of tools don't solve. We think our approach is a lot more effective in a lot of ways. So we have a fork of Postgres that we call Enterprise EDB Postgres Advanced Server, or EPAS, the nice little acronym, that actually provides sophisticated embedded compatibility with Oracle database types, right? And Oracle database functionality. So you don't need to make a migration from, say, blob and clob over to Postgres data types, right? EPAS just supports the Oracle database Oracle types natively. EPAS supports PLSQL natively. EPAS supports a number of Oracle utility packages natively. So we're reducing the number of changes that you have to make in your database applications, or in your database-based applications, the schemas and DML and so on and so forth, so that you have to do less work to get from Oracle to Postgres, right? We're just chopping off a lot of that rote complexity where there's a lot of subtlety there. It's not like we're just doing a type alias and everything's good, right? There's a lot of subtlety in making the decision to make that transition, and we're committed to making the right decision so that you have less risk in your migration, right? Additionally, we provide a set of drivers for EPAS that, while they're compatible with our database, they're sort of shaped more like the Oracle drivers, right? So if you're familiar with the Oracle JDBC driver, and you look at the Postgres JDBC driver, there's a big shift in sort of semantics to get from the Oracle driver to the Postgres driver. The EDB driver is shaped a lot more like the Oracle driver to make it easier for you to just do a simple, cut and paste or a EDB, and you can sort of retain trustworthy semantics through applications. And we think that's really important, right? At the end of the day, we're just trying to reduce the sophistication and the complexity of the migration, right? Now, I said this is a fork. I do want to be clear that this isn't a divergent fork. EDB is the largest single contributor to Postgres. We're very committed to open source Postgres, and we're continuously merging open source back into ePath, right? So Postgres 14 just came out just recently. ePath 14 is going to come out in the next couple of weeks. This is a continuous sort of lockstep development process. We don't expect those two pieces of software to diverge. We're committed to keeping the improvements from Postgres available in ePath, right? It's sort of embedded functionality inside Postgres rather than a different database that you get with something like a Netezza or a Greenplum, that kind of thing. Second, on the tooling perspective, right? The database is one thing, but as we were talking about earlier, right, there's a lot of stuff that goes around the database in terms of how do you get data from point A to point B, and that sort of thing. That's really essential to a successful migration. EDB provides a lot of technology in order to make that easier, right? From assessing your database schemas, actually migrating your data, whether that's in a batch or an online fashion, fallback migrations, data validation, right? How do you ensure that the migration was actually high fidelity? You're not going to discover 3 weeks down the road that you mistranslated some data type from the Oracle system to the Postgres system. How are you going to ensure that that's all accurate, right? There's too many tools here to note, really. It's kind of an ecosystem of support around the core ePath system, right? And finally, our expertise, right? Again, we've been doing this for 15 years. We've seen a lot, right? We've got a lot of folks on staff that have a lot of expertise in this type of technology and this type of work, both, Oracle to Postgres on-prem, but also making databases successful in the cloud, right? Because ultimately the journey is along both of those axes, right? It's database to database and on-prem to cloud. And how do you make yourself successful kind of going from the lower left to the top right quadrants, right? At the end of the day, our business is reducing the complexity, the time, the effort required to migrate away from Oracle and make things simpler for both DBAs, application developers, and ultimately the folks that pay the bills. So I'm going to pass things back to Ashleen now to talk a little bit more about EDB's work in the cloud specifically.
Thank you. Yeah, so at this point, like we've walked through kind of the Oracle options, what's available for Postgres in the cloud, and then what to consider from a migration point of view. And I think it's worth noting, like especially most recently, this is now all available from EDB in the cloud, and we recently launched our fully managed cloud service called BigAnimal. And what I love about this is, so Ben kind of talked about the strength of EDB in terms of being able to help customers kind of ease that transition off of Oracle. And one of the things that's exciting about BigAnimal from our perspective is like we've heard and met with a lot of customers experiencing limited options in the cloud or fairly simple replication models that are not really addressing their needs. And so with BigAnimal, we really center on kind of 3 major capabilities. And these are areas there that we feel we bring sort of unique value from a cloud point of view. And again, they definitely center on what exists for EDB today. So first off, touching on the fact that Ben had mentioned, we've got over 15 years of experience with clients migrating workloads. So our expertise here is really around being able to have kind of the talent, the breadth and depth to be able to help solve your migration challenges and in general, your Postgres database workload needs. And, I think it's important, we're really close to the open source community. We're close to kind of really helping to propel our roadmap and being able to have expertise that goes beyond just sort of an infrastructure level. Like the database is our bread and butter. And I think that speaks to the fact that we've got over 300 plus folks from a technologist point of view focused on Postgres. And then second, is really capitalizing on kind of what Ben had mentioned, is all of that Oracle compatibility comes with our fully managed cloud offering. So, we've got this now in the cloud and comes with sort of all the benefits of that compatibility that Ben mentioned, and making sure that we actually have kind of the folks that can help you, the migration tooling that can help you migrate, and ultimately sort of make you successful towards adopting more of a strategic cloud option for your workloads. And lastly, I think one of the pieces that's really exciting for our business next year is being able to offer continuous availability and to address workloads with more sophisticated high availability requirements. So, you'll remember back in one of the earlier slides, you can't run Oracle RAC in non-Oracle clouds. And, when you're looking at enterprise workloads, sort of thinking about your migration journey, and, if you've been using Oracle for a long time, chances are you've probably got quite a bit of Oracle RAC. And I think one of the things that's really exciting about our business is, as we look to next year, we're actually rolling out continuous availability across multi-region, sort of enabling a multi-geo type of active workload. And this is something that is, coupled with Oracle compatibility, is unmatched in terms of what you can get in a cloud environment. So, we're excited to kind of bring this all to the cloud, share it kind of with you all. And, one of the things I'll just kind of mention is check out our website, BigAnimal.com. You'll be able to sort of sign up for request a free trial from us if you guys want to check it out. And the other thing I'll mention is, like, if you're also more curious about kind of the Oracle migration considerations, want to dive a little bit deeper in that, December 1st, we'll be having a webinar at 10 a.m. Eastern that will dive a little bit more detail into that. So I definitely encourage you to check that out. And if you're looking for a cloud option, I would highly recommend kind of visiting our website and letting us know if there's anything that we can help you with. And with that, I just want to thank you guys for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. I don't see anything popping up, but in this case, Ashley and Ben, thank you so much for sharing all this information. Everyone else who is on the line will be sending out the recording and the slides afterwards. And with that, thank you for joining and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.